second panel is entitled Foucault as a Normative Theorist. It brings together Carsten Schubert, who is assistant professor at the University of Freiburg in Breisgau in the south of Germany, and Frédéric Gros, who is a professor of political theory here at the CEVIPOF at Sciences Po. Carsten Schubert is going to talk first, and his presentation is entitled Dimensions of Freedom in Foucault's Work. Actually, this updated title, excuse me, there's an updated title. There it is, Foucault's Freedom as Critique Against Anarchist Readings for an Institutional Approach. The floor is yours, Carsten.
Yes, thank you very much, Niklas, for organizing this, and thank you very much, Frédéric Gros. I think this is a really great opportunity to bring the different perspectives together, and I will just start. So, the title is here, Foucault's Freedom as Critique Against Anarchist Readings and for an Institutional Approach. And the question of the paper is this: how is freedom possible in Foucault's theory of power and subjectification? Freedom is problematic in Foucault's theory because he seems to think that power is subjecting individuals so thoroughly that it renders freedom impossible. This problem of freedom was articulated not by Foucault himself, but by particular readers of Foucault. Social philosophers who interpret Foucault's genealogical analysis as a contribution to social philosophical debates about freedom, and who are therefore interested in the theoretical coherence of his works. And there are several approaches to solve this problem of freedom and read Foucault as a coherent social philosopher in the existing literature. And that is mainly the English and German literature. And I reconstruct and criticize these approaches in my book Freedom as Critique, Social Philosophy After Foucault. But today I will focus on one feature which is prevalent in most of these analyses, and that is to refer to the late text of Foucault, The Subject and Power. And this text is special because it's one of the few texts where Foucault writes in an explicitly social philosophical idiom, in difference to his normal style and method, the genealogical analysis. Foucault writes quite clearly here that freedom is a presupposition of power, and many interpret this as a solution to the problem of freedom. I call this interpretation the standard view, as it is commonly held among social philosophical Foucault interpreters nowadays. And my thesis is that it is wrong, as it does not solve the right problem. Because actually there are two different kinds of problems. I call these problems the problem of power determination and the problem of subjectification. I will argue that the standard view only solves the problem of power determination and not the problem of subjectification. And to differentiate these problems in this way is the crucial first step to ask how the problem of subjectification could be solved, and therefore today I will concentrate on this task. So in what follows, I present first the standard view. Second, I elaborate on the problem of subjectification and show what would be needed to solve it, and that is an account of freedom as critique. Third, I explain that the standard view only explains freedom to act differently, but not freedom as critique. So there's a crucial differentiations between different concepts of freedom in the talk. I conclude by sketching how the problem could be solved, and that is by conceptualizing free subjectification through political institutions, which means to read Foucault as a normative political theorist and not as an anarchist. In the archaeological phase, the problem of freedom is centered on language and thinking. Foucault shows that the possibilities of thinking are fundamentally limited due to their dependence on an historical a priori, the episteme. All discourses in which thought is expressed are ordered and regulated through their internal rules in relation to the episteme. They are not therefore dependent on individual subjects' thinking or a historical reason, but fundamentally contingent. This is a problem of freedom because this social theory shows that traditional concepts of freedom cannot be upheld. freedom cannot be defined as arbitrary will, as in classical liberalism, nor as reason, as in Kantianism, nor as historical progress and social integration, as in Hegelianism. Foucault extends his social theory then to the realm of power and social institutions and bodies in his genealogical phase. Discipline and Punish is both a genealogy of the modern prison and a critique of modern capitalism as based on the same social technologies which are used to discipline and subject individuals in the prison. Through its rejection of the methods of normative social philosophy which would enable to differentiate liberating and repressive aspects of modernity, and its rejection of an account of socialization which would explain how individuals develop own agency, Discipline of Punish presents a picture of modern society as total repression. That there is no outside of power is the central critical insight of Foucault's intervention. But when this power is conceptualized as only repressive, there is neither a place for freedom in this picture nor for related concepts like resistance and emancipation. So this was a sketch how this problem was discussed in the secondary literature, and this is what I call the problem of power determination. So I call this the problem of power determination in order to distinguish it from the problem of subjectification, which I will introduce in the following section. And I think it is crucial to distinguish these two problems, and it is a shortcoming of current commentaries on Foucault not to do this. A central step of my argument, therefore, will be to show that solving the problem of power determination is not enough, and that the problem of subjectification needs to be solved. So, coming back to this standard view, the standard view finds a solution of the problem of power determination in Foucault's late work, in his ethical phase, and especially the conceptual text, The Subject and Power. The argument of the standard view is that Foucault here corrects his earlier conceptual mistakes and comes up with a refined theory of power and freedom. In Subject of Power, Foucault develops an action theoretical model of power and defines power as, citation, relationship between partners and an ensemble of actions which induce others and follow from one another, citation end. Foucault is as explicit as one can be regarding the problem of power determination, which seems to exclude freedom. The definition of power, citation, includes an important element, freedom. Power is exercised only over free subjects and only insofar as they are free, citation end. So Foucault posits freedom social-ontologically and explains that the concept of power analytically presupposes freedom. It just doesn't make sense to talk about power when there is no freedom to act differently. So, and therefore, I call this concept of freedom, of always being able to act differently, analytical freedom. From this fundamental freedom, Foucault then deduces resistance. Citation, at the heart of power relations, there's an insubordination and a certain essential obstinacy. There's no relationship of power without the means of escape or possible flight. Citation end. In the standard view, these changes in the theory are taken to solve the problem of power determination, mainly that it was unclear how human beings can be free and resist power. Foucault now comes from the assumption that human beings can always resist in relations of power. Following the standard view, this is finally a coherent concept of the equiprimordiality of power and freedom and allows for the important distinction between power and domination, which was absent from Foucault's earlier works. And this distinction between power and domination is important in the standard view as it contains a normative position and therefore is taken to be a solution to the problem that Foucault is normatively confused or contradictory. Power is the term which denominates the social ontological fact of power always coming together with analytic freedom. It is a general, fundamental fact of the social, which is why it can neither be disposed nor normatively valued or criticized as such. Foucault describes power as an antagonistic strategic game or struggle, a dynamic relation. If one side wins and the free power struggle is over, then domination occurs, where power is blocked and frozen. These two last words were citations from Foucault. So, to sum up, power is characterized first through its social ontological generality. It's always there. And second, through its mobile, reversible, and unstable or liquid physical state. And in difference to power, domination is power's internal limit, or the internal other of power. That is a specific case of solidification of power relations. Domination, according to Foucault, means the special case of blocked, frozen, respectively solidified power, which prevents reversion in movement. Freedom and domination are now opposites because domination limits the free dynamics of power. The distinction of power and domination, thus, is Foucault's answer to the constant critique that his thinking misses normative orientation. Domination is bad because it limits freedom, while free games of power are good. Now, this is the very schematic normativity here. The distinction between power and domination as free and unfree power is so central for many recipients because it opens up the possibility of a political critique of domination. The normativity of the standard view is to reduce domination in order to protect freedom. And note here that this amounts to a concept, a very classical concept of negative freedom, which is put forward by classical political liberalism, and which is at odds with the whole concept of subjectification. Nevertheless, the distinction between liquid power and therefore freedom and solidified domination helps to conceptually break out of the dark vision of the totality of modern repressive disciplinary power, which some saw in Discipline and Punish. Subjects are not mere objects of the intensification of power through discipline in modernity, but they can and in fact do resist. So, the haunting problem of power determination is successfully solved. My thesis now is that the standard view is flawed because it solves the wrong problem. The problem of power determination, which it solves, is not what the debate of freedom in Foucault's works is really about. The debate is in fact about the problem of subjectification. But because many interpreters do not differentiate the two problems, they take the solution to the problem of power determination as a solution for the problem of subjectification. So, the second chapter, the problem of subjectification and freedom as critique. While the problem of determination consists in an interpretation of Foucault's genealogical works, especially Discipline and Punish, as describing a totality of power which determines individuals, the problem of subjectification is present in later works, especially on governmentality. In his history of governmentality, Foucault differentiates his conception of power into three different types: sovereignty, government, and discipline. Discipline is the power which subjectivates in a way that it subjects individuals. Hence, the problem of power determination in a book which only describes this kind of power, Discipline and Punish. Government now, on the other hand, is a way more subtle form of power, which is actually based on freedom. Foucault's theory of power, which he puts forward in The Subject of Power, and which I just reconstructed, is actually a systematization of his genealogy of government, especially of the pastoral power and early liberalism. In both, government is the conduct of the action of others, and freedom is not only a presupposition of these forms of power, but also produced by power itself for its strategic goals. Foucault, and following him the scholars in the field of governmentality studies, showed that especially neoliberal government makes freedom its main strategy. In order to produce a productive neoliberal subject, this subject has to be free. only a free subject can be creative, self-responsible, and innovative. Therefore, neoliberal subjectification does not operate through subjecting subjects, but through incentives to become free and even resistant. The resistance against inefficient structures is taken to be an important driver for the improvement in neoliberalism. And this makes the whole story way more complicated and leads to the problem of subjectification. Of course, power and freedom are no opposites, but the freedom in neoliberalism is actually a strategy of power itself. Even resistance against power could be a strategy of power. While there's no problem anymore to speak about freedom in the theory of power, it is not clear now if this freedom is the freedom one could want. On the contrary, even the free self-constituting activity of the subject is dependent on subjectification through power. Freedom might be only neoliberal freedom. In the analysis of governmentality and the concept of power and freedom as equiprimordial opens up the possibility of a totally repressive neoliberal power which is supported by neoliberal freedom. So now we have the concept of subjectification, which is compatible with freedom, but we still have the justified suspicion that we are way more thoroughly subjected through power than we usually think. The problem of subjectification is that we do not know how free we actually are. The analysis of neoliberal government shows that neoliberal freedom is not desirable and does not allow for resistance against neoliberal government, which leads to the question what real freedom can be and how it can be conceptualized in the framework of subjectification. Now, while this problem is very visible in the case of neoliberalism, I do not call this the problem of neoliberalism, but the problem of subjectification. And the reason is that it arises from the concept of subjectification itself, the complex constitution of the subject through the interaction of self-constitution and constitution through power. Following the radical historicism which underlies the theory of power and subjectification, also the self-techniques which the subject uses to constitute itself freely are fundamentally dependent on the regime of subjectification in a given time and place, thus power. Within this conception, there's no differentiation possible between freedom as a strategy of power and real freedom that would allow for resistance against power. The problem of subjectification, therefore, is an intensification of the problem of power determination. The problem of determination was an unrealistic depiction of society not allowing for freedom at all. But the problem of subjectification is way more severe. While there's freedom, even this freedom is constituted and subtly repressed by power. The problem of subjectification is that it is unclear to distinguish repressive and real freedom. So now it's very problematic. So the question is, how can this problem of subjectification be solved? And that is how to deal with the reasonable suspicion that we are deeper, even in our free actions, steered by power, than we usually think we are. And the answer, I claim, is a differentiation of the term freedom. It is necessary to find a concept of freedom which can account for the activity of the subject independent of power without giving up the hypothesis of subjectification that subjectivity is fundamentally constituted by power. And it's actually not that problematic because such a concept of freedom is already developed by Foucault in his reflections on his own method of genealogy in his later works. And I call it freedom as critique, or long freedom as the capability to critically reflect on one's own subjectification. describes genealogical critique as an ontology of the present or history of the present, which is part of a practice of freedom, as it aims at a critical reflection of subjectification. It renders subtle repression visible and thereby opens the possibility to change one's identity, ethics, and politics. More systematically, freedom as critique can be described as a reflection of higher order than the immediate reflection, which allows to transgress the immediate reflection. In other words, it is a certain technology of the self which aims at reflecting the potential influence of power on all self-technologies. While also freedom as critique is dependent on subjectification, that means absolute freedom or freedom as a fixed status is impossible, it is a movement which always aims at transgressing itself and thereby reaches as much independence and distance from subjectification as possible. It is an internalized hermeneutics of suspicion which always critically rechecks everything, including itself. It never stops, but adds critical operation on critical operation. It is an operation of infinite order and therefore a practice and not a status or state, and nevertheless dependent on capabilities. Through this operation of critique, which is the work of the self on the self, a subject can transform itself and emancipate itself from the subjectifications which constituted it in the first place. It can reach independence and autonomy vis-à-vis the outside which constituted it. Something new is created which cannot be reduced to power. Freedom is an emergent level of operation vis-à-vis the subjectifications which constituted the subject. It is inner psychic emergence. How the new gets into the world is not predictable, but it is predictable that this sort of inner psychic emergence becomes more likely due to free subjectifications. The method of genealogical critique aims at creating it and can therefore be called critical of free subjectification. But there can be other subjectifications, other critical subjectifications than genealogical critique. The point is that freedom as critique cannot be presupposed in the subject, but it can only be the result of former subjectifications. It has to come from the outside. It cannot be presupposed. And to put this very, very simple, it has to be learned and trained. So, third, why the standard view fails. So, the standard view is that the problem of freedom is solved in Foucault's later works. Through the differentiation of the problem into two problems, which I introduced, power determination and subjectification, it is now possible to see why it fails. It solves the wrong problem. It succeeds in solving the problem of power determination, but not the problem of subjectification. The reason is that in order to solve the problem of subjectification, it is necessary to give an account of freedom as critique. But the solution of the problem of power determination in the subject and power only gives an account of analytic freedom as the capacity to always act differently. The social ontological and analytical description of power as necessarily connected with freedom is formalistic and empty. It is analytic insofar as this rudimentary concept of freedom can be derived already from the concept of power, and it does not add anything. It also, I also describe it as freedom to always act differently, as it denotes the fundamental capability to choose in a given moment between different actions available in a predetermined action environment. And such basal freedom can be even attributed to the disciplined and subjective subjects of discipline and punish, and that does not already enable them to be politically resistant. So there lies the difference. The concept of analytic freedom solves the problem of power determination, as Foucault writes explicitly that power presupposes freedom. But to account for analytical freedom is not already an account of freedom of resistant freedom or freedom as critique, which would be the concept, the capabilities which characterize resistant subjectivities, resistant political subjects. This is not only a problem of Foucault's readers to confuse the different concepts of freedom. Foucault does that himself. After the formalistic description of freedom in Subject and Power, Foucault surprisingly charged the concept of freedom with a specific content and connects it to resistance. Foucault described freedom as necessarily resistant, saying it is a reaction to power's attempt to determine freedom. But if resistance is supposed to be more than just the freedom to act differently, which is analytically presupposed by power, it is necessary to say more about the conditions of this kind of resistance. Resistance is based on the demanding capability of critique, which can be only the result of specific subjectifications and not a general social fact. There is not always resistance. Resistance is a special case. The problem is that Foucault social ontologically generalizes resistance as he generalizes analytic freedom. And that precludes the possibility to ask about the specific conditions of possibility of resistance. Foucault does not distinguish two different modalities of resistance: its general possibility and its probability or actuality. Through his action-theoretical social ontology and the analytic concept of freedom, he can show that there is the general possibility of resistance, but not its actuality or probability. Statements about the probability of freedom can be named morally robust, more morally robust than statements which state the general possibility of freedom. This argument from model robustness says that a social theoretical account of freedom should not stop with stating the general possibility of freedom, but should differentiate situations according to the probability of freedom. Resistance does not always exist. It is only not generally impossible. It is therefore impossible to speak about such resistance in generalizing terms as Foucault does, but it is necessary to explain how its general possibility can be transformed into actuality. To preliminary conclude, in The Subject and Power, Foucault assumes that there is resistance, as he did in the analysis of power in the 70s, but his action-theoretical and analytical explanation of resistance contains gaps and problems. Foucault's late thought on power is therefore rather a supplementation of his former social theory than an advancement which solves the problem of subjectification. This means the standard view, which holds that the problem of subjectification is actually solved, giving an account of freedom to act differently, is wrong. The standard view, as Foucault himself, is incoherent because it does not differentiate the two problems and the two concepts of freedom, and therefore cannot differentiate between the general possibility and the probability of resistance. And this has consequences. This has the consequences not to research the relationship of practices of government and practices of freedom and how it affects the probabilities of resistant subjectivity. Rather, in this framework, and we see that in a lot of post-Foucauldian works, social critique is limited to the optimistic assumption that there will be always critique, reducing critical research to happily highlighting existing resistances. All this research about current social movements and happy critical researchers which say, finally there is the resistance. And this, even though the problem of subjectification consists in the fact that resistant subjectivity is unlikely. That's the whole point of Foucault's rather pessimistic outlook. To be clear, the problem here is not that the standard view misreads Foucault. Rather, it is not sincere to its own problem, the problem of the standard view, which is not Foucault's problem. Foucault is not a social theorist in this style I'm doing. So it is not sincere to its own problem, the social theoretical problem of freedom, more precisely the problem of subjectification. If the question is, as it is in the secondary literature, how is resistance possible? To state that specific resistances had happened in the past in order to appeal to future resistance is not satisfactory. So, conclusion, what to do? What then is a solution to the problem of subjectification? My hypothesis is that it lies in a normative differentiation of government and its subjectifications. The reason is that freedom as critique is such a demanding capability that it cannot be presupposed in the subject. It can only be the result of specific regimes of subjectification, which I call free or critical subjectification. The task, thus, is to identify modally robust social structures, in Foucault words, the term for that would be government, of critical subjectification. In other words, we need to normatively differentiate political institutions according to their subjectification. And this entails a rather un-Foucauldian term, to connect the theory of subjectification with political theory, understood as normative thinking about institutions. Thus, to break with Foucault's partly anarchist commitments. Following this way is pretty promising, I think, as it not only allows to finally understand what freedom can mean in the theory of subjectification, it also opens the new possibility to engage Foucault with democratic theory. In my book, I argue that the Foucauldian concept of freedom leads to a post-foundationalist, pluralist, and liberal theory of democracy. But today, I'm very happy if I was able to convince you that there is a problem at all with the standard view, and that it is crucial to think more about regimes of subjectification in order to give an account of freedom as critique. And that it is necessary to leave behind the anarchist elements which can be found in Foucault, and to develop an institutionalist approach of subjectification and freedom. Thank you very much. Okay. Because the first notion of the strong transcendental subjectivity, this is what I was criticizing when I was saying freedom as critique cannot be presupposed. And I think the interesting thing is that Foucauldians who think that are falling back in this liberal framework of presupposing capabilities in the subject prior to subjectification, prior to socialization. And so the whole point of the argument in this presentation here is to say, no, we have to look on the social structures which make capabilities, which instantiate capabilities in the subject. So it's a kind of dialectic relationship between institutions and subjects. Because what the subjects then do, maybe, is to criticize the institutions. And the institutions, from this normative notion of freedom as critique, as a kind of general concept in political theory, then lead to an institutional theory which deeply implements constant critique of power structures and keep themselves open for the critique of the subjects and subjectivate the subjects in this way. So it's a kind of circularity, and in connection to, for example, the Hornetian approaches, it's then an outlook on institutions which are kind of one step further reflective against the kind of pathologies of power, I'd say.
If I can I ask? Sure. Yeah. No, so subjectification, is it for you a negative term? Is it supposed to be like that? We don't want to be subjectified.
No. That is a social ontological neutral term, and there can be repressive subjectification or critical free subjectification, to put it very schematically. And the problem of subjectification is a pretty epistemological one, that we as subjectivated subjects don't actually quite know. So the only thing we can say on this generalized abstract level of social theory is we need more critique to check with open results.
Okay, I'll be brief. You know that I'm not quite convinced. But my question is, how much do you retain of the standard view, actually? Because, I mean, what you describe as the standard view arises from a very specific discussion in, let's say, political or social theory in the Anglo-American German context, right? Which has a lot of very heavy presuppositions. One is that we need to distinguish resistance and power in strong normative terms. Whereas Foucault's historical work is precisely about this is not a distinction that we should and can make. The whole point, for example, about the natural rights movement in the 18th century is to show how this resistance in this time is actually a framework for governing at a later stage. And you find numerous instances of these in Frankfurt we would say dialectic, right? Here we could say strategic reversals. But what you want to do is precisely to write this out of Foucault with the end. And then I think there's nothing left. Foucault is not a social ontologist, he's not a social theorist, you said it yourself. He's not about a pure concept of resistance or freedom that you are presupposing, as you numerously said, right? Resistance free of power, pure freedom. So there is no Foucault left in the end. So why bother, actually?
Well, we have this, the why bother is precisely connecting to the debates we had earlier with your discussion. How, what can Foucault give us in critical social theory? And I think there's a lot which can be learned from this effort of systematizing social theory on philosophy, which is not at all in the style Foucault would work, and probably also kind of violating the ethos of his,
no, but the
his
results, you are emptying out all the results. And this is why I'm just asking, why then?
Yeah. No, but I think there are new results. The Foucauldian results are not. I mean, Foucault can have a happily coexistence with my post-Foucauldian Foucauldianism. I think there's no strong contradiction. I claim that if you are interested in the problems which are put forward in this debate, you have to do it the way I propose it, and not in the way it has been done. I don't say that Foucault should have done this. And so this is why very explicitly I locate this work in these debates. So you are perfectly right that I take a lot of presuppositions from this debate. This is where this research is located in. And I think there's a lot to learn from that. So yeah, and I think it's not in kind of, this is not threatening Foucauldian legacy. So there is a coexistence in having these different questions.
I have just a short note and a question. The note is about subjectivization. Because I think you answered it's a neutral term. It's not a neutral term in Foucault. You have actually two meanings, and the difficulty is to think the two both in the same time, which is subjection and subjectivation. And one is negative, and the other is always producing something new. So my question is, when you say that freedom as critique as to have something more, I'm quoting you, something more, you don't characterize this something more. What it is exactly?
The concept is formalistic. So the something more cannot be named out of the philosophical theory.
I mean, I'm from a political point of view.
No, I don't think it is, because the something more, something new is that both subjects and political institutions need to find structures to always criticize more. So kind of this, to give a new foundation for this ongoing critical work is the important content for political theory, and it is actually very important that it is not prematurely charged with specific political content, because of course this can be very easily connected to all kinds of leftist interests, like queer theory, for example, is the prime field to continually question gender norms and to then question the new gender norms and the regimes of identifying with new categories, etc., etc. So it's a perfect example. But in the current leftist Foucauldian research, which operates with such a notion of freedom as critique, often the answer is too quickly located in social spheres which present themselves as critical and resistant. And this is kind of a critical argument against this scholarship, that the hermeneutics of suspicion against all kinds of power, which is the core of this concept of freedom, has to be applied also against the projects we intuitively, normatively support. And this is why the argument is saying it needs to be transferred to a reflection of political institutions in a pluralistic liberal framework.
Okay, maybe we can continue this on this point afterwards. Thank you so much again, Carsten.